In 1324, a king rode into Cairo with so much gold in his caravan that he single-handedly crashed the region's economy. Prices didn't recover for over a decade. He wasn't European. He wasn't a myth. He was the ruler of an African empire richer than almost anything in the medieval world. And if you've never heard his name, that's not an accident. It's the entire problem this video is about to unpack. Here's the uncomfortable starting point. Most of what gets called history was written by the winners. Conquerors wrote the record of the conquered. Enslavers wrote the record of the enslaved. Colonial officials wrote the record of the colonized. That doesn't make every historical document worthless, but it does mean a huge amount of what we think we know about Black history was filtered through people who benefited from the story being incomplete. The fuller picture, pieced together from archaeology, oral tradition, and records produced from within these communities, is longer, richer, and considerably more complicated than what usually fits into a single unit between Thanksgiving and winter break. So let's start at the actual beginning, not the middle. Every human being alive today, regardless of appearance or geography, traces their ancestry back to Africa. That's not a metaphor or a talking point. It's the settled consensus of genetics, paleoanthropology, and archaeology. Which means Black history isn't a chapter inserted into a larger human story. It's the opening chapter of all human history. For most of the last 100,000 years, African societies took an almost incomprehensible range of forms. Hunter-gatherer communities like the San of southern Africa, with traditions stretching back tens of thousands of years, and agricultural societies across the Sahel, developing sophisticated land and livestock management long before any outside contact. And starting around 3,000 years ago, something happened that most world history classes barely mention. Empires. Real, massive, wealthy states, whose scale genuinely stunned European visitors centuries later. The Kingdom of Kush grew powerful enough to conquer Egypt itself, producing a dynasty of Nubian pharaohs. The Aksumite Kingdom in modern Ethiopia became one of the four great powers of the ancient world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China, minting its own currency and adopting Christianity as a state religion in the 4th century, well before most of Europe did. Great Zimbabwe's stone walls, built with no mortar at all, still stand today. And the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai controlled the trans-Saharan gold and salt trade for roughly 1,000 years. Which brings us back to that king from the opening, Mansa Musa of Mali, whose 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca was so lavish it depressed Mediterranean gold prices for years afterward. That's not even the twist yet. Stick with this, because what happens next to these civilizations is the part that reframes everything. When the transatlantic slave trade began in earnest in the 15th century, it didn't happen to primitive societies waiting to be discovered. It happened to sophisticated civilizations with their own governments, scholarship, and centuries of accumulated wealth. Timbuktu alone housed libraries with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on law, medicine, and astronomy, many of which still survive today. The slave trade wasn't a rescue or an origin story. It was the deliberate, systematic destruction of thriving societies, on a scale that's genuinely hard to hold in your head. Somewhere between 10 and 12 million people survived the ocean crossing alone, over roughly 400 years, in what remains the largest forced migration in recorded history to that point. If you're finding out how much of this was left out of what you were taught, subscribe, because the part of this story that gets told even less is what happened after. Because here's what standard accounts consistently underplay: how people actually survived it. Enslaved communities didn't just endure. They preserved language, spiritual practice, kinship structures, and music, deliberately, collectively, under conditions designed to erase all of it. That preserved musical tradition became, over generations, the foundation of nearly every major American music genre of the 20th century. Blues, jazz, gospel, soul, funk, hip-hop, created by people who were legally denied basic rights the entire time they were building it. And resistance was constant, far more organized than most people realize. In the 1790s, a colony of enslaved people in Haiti did something no one thought possible. They defeated Napoleon's army and founded the first free Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. The response? decades of economic isolation from the world's slaveholding powers, and France extracting the modern equivalent of tens of billions of dollars from Haiti in reparations, payments Haiti was still making until 1947. After formal abolition, there was a brief window, Reconstruction, where Black Americans voted, held office, built institutions, and showed exactly what political equality could look like. That window didn't close because it failed. It was violently, deliberately dismantled, replaced by nearly a century of legal segregation. And even inside that system, Black communities built HBCUs that trained generations of doctors and lawyers, when nearly every other door was shut. The Harlem Renaissance produced a literary and artistic movement defining Black identity entirely on its own terms. Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, and W.E.B. Du Bois weren't minor footnotes. They were among the sharpest political minds of their eras, full stop. The 20th century brought transformation on two continents at once. The civil rights movement wasn't simply an appeal to American conscience that succeeded because the country came around. It was strategically disciplined organizing, sustained by ordinary people absorbing real violence and risk, deliberately designed to make injustice visible on a global stage during the Cold War. At the same time, across Africa, decolonization turned a handful of independent nations in 1945 into dozens by 1970, led by thinkers like Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere, engaging with questions of identity and statehood on a genuinely sophisticated level. In South Africa, apartheid held for nearly 50 years, until Nelson Mandela walked free after 27 years in prison and was elected president in 1994, a transition that defied nearly every prediction of the violence that was supposed to follow. None of this is a side story, and none of it is finished. Black communities from Brazil to Britain to the Caribbean carry distinct histories while sharing certain threads, including a global cultural influence in music, film, and art that's almost unmatched, built by a community that spent most of its history excluded from formal power entirely. And here's what gets lost most often when this story gets compressed: the specific role of Black women, who are too often folded into the background of a story that ran on their labor. Harriet Tubman made roughly 19 missions back into slave territory. Fannie Lou Hamer and Diane Nash carried organizational weight the spotlight rarely credited them for. And the religious traditions born from all of this, Vodou, Candomblé, the Black Church itself, weren't compromises. They were sophisticated theological creations that encoded resistance and preserved culture at the same time. So what was this history actually? It was ancient before it was anything else. Wealthy and scholarly before it was targeted. Resistant and creative, under conditions built specifically to prevent resistance and creativity. It's one of the longest, most consequential stories in the entire human record, and by any honest measure, still being recovered, and still being told.